Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Institute's event, National Environmental Impacts of Data Center Proliferation. My name is Madison Calhoun, and I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today, as well as give a huge thank you to our wonderful speakers for preparing a fantastic program for you all. I'm now excited to introduce and turn things over to Alexandria Nelson. Alexandria is the Environmental Law Institute's new Program Director for Digital Economy and the Environment. She is the Director of the Network on the Digital Economy and the Environment and DEE, and she currently manages projects at ELI related to the environmental impact of data centers, AI, and other aspects of the digital economy. Alexandria, I'll hand things over to you to talk a little bit more about NDEE. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Madison. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name, as Madison mentioned, is Alexandria Nelson, and I'm really honored to be here today as the new program director of the Digital Economy Environment program here at ELI. I've been here about a month, so I'm really getting my feet under me, and I'm really pleased to share the virtual stage today with such esteemed company. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little bit about our program. Can we have the next slide, please? Maybe one more. There we go. Perfect. The Digital Economy and Environment program here at the Environmental Law Institute focuses on how we can better understand the environmental impacts and opportunities created through emerging technologies, structural changes in the economy, and new roles for the public in environmental research and protection. We run the Network for the Digital Economy and Environment, or NDEE for short, which works to catalyze and disseminate research on the energy and environmental impacts of the digital economy. The NDE is a collaboration between the Environmental Law Institute, the Yale School of the Environment, and the Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment at the University of California, Berkeley. If you liked today's webinar and you'd like to stay informed about more, you can go ahead and check out our website, which has our upcoming webinars, research, and events. And on that website, you can also sign up for our newsletter. The website is also home to our bibliography, which has a database of over 1,100 articles and resources on the energy and environmental impacts of the digital economy. Also, this is the second webinar in our series about the environmental impacts of data centers. If you missed the last one about the local environmental impacts of data centers, we invite you to watch the recording, which is on the ELI website. Now, to get us started, I'm going to hand the mic over to our wonderful facilitator, Tim Mealy. Tim has over 40 years of experience in designing and facilitating national and international policy dialogues around environmental and social issues. He was the co-founder and managing director at the Meridian Institute. And most importantly, he has been the co-founder and is an ongoing advisor for the NDE project. We're really lucky to have him lead such an exciting conversation today. So I'll hand it over to Tim to introduce our panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexandria. What you see on your screen right now is the list of the panelists that we've been able to pull together for this event, and we're very pleased to have all four of these participants. I'm going to do a brief introduction in a moment here of all the panelists. And what we're going to do is sort of in a traditional webinar format. We'll go through a series of presentation, not quite in the order that you see the people listed there. I'll list them out in the order that they'll be presenting. And then we're going to have hopefully time for some interaction between the panelists, any comments they want to make on each other's presentation or questions they have towards each other. And then we're going to preserve a good, hopefully 15 minutes at the end for questions that you as participants will pose, and we'll be looking primarily at the Q&A. So please pose your questions in the Q&A button, through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You should be able to access that. And also feel free to engage through the chat, and we'll try to, if there's any questions raised there that aren't in the Q&A, we'll try to get to those as well. So let me introduce the panelists here. Dr. Arman Shehabi is a staff scientist in the Energy and Analysis and Environmental Impacts Division at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Arman has over 15 years of experience measuring and modeling the potential energy and economic and air pollutant impacts associated with large-scale adoption of clean energy policy and technologies for buildings and manufacturing, with extensive research on the ICT sector, the information and communications technology sector. We've asked Dr. Shehabi to present the key findings and conclusions of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab report, the United States Data Center Energy Usage Report, with a special emphasis on the recommendations on the need for more and better quality data and research. Dr. Shehabi's presentation will be followed by Vincent Giacomin, who is a junior modeler at the International Energy Agency, where he leads in the development and enhancement of the data center energy demand model that IEA has, and conducts extensive research and monitors trends in data center technologies, policy, and industrial developments. We've asked Vincent to focus on how does the LBNL report compare to other reports from other countries or from the IEA, and how can other countries build upon the report, the LBNL report, in terms of its methodologies and analytics, or how to fill the data gaps that it identifies, and what are IEA's plans to assess the energy and environmental impacts of data center proliferation in the future. Following Vincent, Dr. Tanya Das, who's the Director of AI and Energy Technology Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Tanya is an engineer by training who uses her problem-solving skills to strengthen federal initiatives at the intersection of energy and technology policy. She has experience in both academia and government prior to her work at BPC. We've asked Tanya to focus on what are the high-level federal policy issues and implications of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab report, and what, if any, discussions are happening in Congress and in the Trump administration to address these policy issues and implications. And finally, Dr. Kelly Sanders, who's an associate professor at the University of Southern California in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, will be our final speaker. And Kelly's research focuses on aims to ease tension between human and natural systems, with particular emphasis on reducing environmental impacts of providing energy and water, analyzing the tensions between climate change adaptation mitigation strategies, and anticipating the effects of climate change on energy systems. We've asked Kelly to focus on how do the energy and environmental impacts of data center proliferation intersect with broader systems level energy and environmental issues associated with the acceleration of the electrification of the economy, and to what extent is data center proliferations serving as a forcing mechanism for broader societal transformations. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Arman to kick us off with a presentation of the U.S. Data Center Energy Usage Report. So Arman, thank you for joining us. I think he was on another webinar just a moment ago presenting on the report. So thank you so much for fitting this in.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, jumping from one thing to another, but this is a popular topic right now, and I'm happy to go over it. So I think what I'm going to do today, as Tim mentioned, I have been working on a report to Congress and on data center electricity use. And I'm going to give just a little bit of background first. So if we just go to the next slide. So a little bit of background here. When LBL, Lawrence Berkeley Labs has been involved with data center modeling for like over 20 years now. This first started on data centers. This first started like back in the 2000s when information was coming out that there was a large growth in electricity use. There was sort of there was a report that came out or a paper that came out that showed like a doubling of electricity use in the 2000s. And that was the first time that Congress asked us to develop a model to estimate like what the electricity use going forward would look like in data centers. Next slide. there's a very little data on data centers. Oddly enough, like there's not much information there, and so what we have to do is build up a bottom-up model. It's kind of this rigorous process of calculating out like every piece of equipment that might go into data centers, categorizing them into different types of equipment, how it might operate in different locations, how it might operate under other circumstances, how that equipment might be cooled depending on the data center. All of those things have to go into account. And we started building this up back in the 2000s for our first report. If you go to the next slide. And we came out with our first study, which showed, indeed, electricity use was doubling, from 2000 to about 2006. And we made different projections of how electricity use could increase going forward under different pathways of the implementation of different technologies, operations, and different policy. And there was a wide range here because we saw that there was a lot of different inefficiencies that were in the system at this time. There was a lot of excessive cooling, a lot of equipment sitting around idle. So there was a lot of opportunity for that. If you go to the next slide. In 2016, we put out another report to Congress, and what we saw was a flattening, really, of the electricity use that occurred after that in the teens, like going from really like around 2010 to about to when we put this out in 2016. Electricity use hadn't really grown much, even though the industry had grown like extremely during this amount of time. And so we came out with different estimates of where we thought things could go from this point on, applying different efficiency measures, where there was already measures being taken where we were seeing much better use of air conditioning, much better use of not having a server sitting around doing nothing, much higher utilization of equipment overall. And so we were able to kind of estimate like that this could stay flat. It could potentially even go down further. And so this is what we had kind of going into the 2020s. And we did this recent report, and our estimate now, like if you go to the next slide, we saw that it drastically changed, and we saw this large increase, as sort of the growth of AI started occurring. Here, there was quite a large difference. And so the key then was, how are things going to go moving forward? And so I put this all out here first to kind of start us off, to kind of highlight, like we are building like fairly sophisticated models, detailed on lots of equipment, and each time things change quite drastically. And so let's talk about, why do things change, and what's the reason why we're not able to capture them before. Next slide. So here in this first kind of turning point that we saw, like, why did it flatten out here? It flattened out here because there was a shift in the industry. The industry, I mean, first there was the sort of economic recession, and then as the economy started building up again, we saw that the data center industry started consolidating. There was more of the idea of the cloud, and these larger consolidated data centers started coming online, and that sort of changing of data center infrastructure allowed for much more efficiency, like just a scaling of efficiencies from a cooling and IT operations. So that would allow things to really flatten out there. Next slide. Just one more slide. Okay, I think it jumped, but so yeah, there it goes. So the next turning point that we saw was why did this start increasing now? And this is because it was a new type of hardware that came online that, when we did the report in 2016, wasn't really around, and that was this idea of accelerated servers. That's servers that have something besides a CPU operating on the computational side, and that's what that is essentially are GPUs, so the NVIDIA chips. Like that's something that supports the CPU, which is used for parallel processing, machine learning, and AI. And so this new emergence of a new type of technology, changed everything, and the rapid increase of this equipment going into data centers is what was driving this growth going forward. Next slide. So then the question is, what's going to happen now? Are we going to see it keep increasing, or is it going to flatten out, or is it going to be something in between that? And so that's what we were trying to look at kind of going forward. The next slide. So a little bit on what we saw in the report here. This is sort of our key takeaway slide that kind of shows where the growth of data centers in the U.S. In terms of electricity use. And it's easiest to think about it in terms of the percentage of electricity of the total US electricity. And so what we saw was like in 2018, it was a little less than 2% of US total electricity. It jumped up to 4.4% by 2023. And then looking forward, we didn't have pathways this time because there's so little data out there. There's so much uncertainty around understanding the evolution of this technology, because we have such a nascent technology with AI right now, that we really showed a range that it's going to grow, but it's either going to grow a lot or even more, and that's in the range of like 6.7 to 12% of U.S. electricity by 2028. Next slide. So what's driving that growth? Two key things I want to show here. First is what's driving it is when we look at the server electricity use. So this is a subset of the model here. This server electricity use is showing what kind of servers are driving the electricity use. And you can see here, anything that has like a GPU in here, or it says AI, those colors, in this figure were essentially not there at all prior to 2018. They end up being about half by 2023. And then moving forward, they're all of the growth going forward and the uncertainty going forward to 2028. And next slide. Where is this happening? Oh, one more slide. Okay, there we go. Where is this happening? It's happening in large data centers. Right now, that type of server equipment that I'm talking about is very expensive. It's also limited in its production because it's so popular right now that every chip these chips are being made as fast as they can be made, and they're already essentially bought before they're even made. So there's high demand for them. They're very expensive. One of these servers can cost $500,000. And so we're seeing these go to the large companies, and those large companies are operating them in large data centers for the most part. So those are, these are different categories of data centers. So the key thing to know is like the first couple on this list are large data centers. They're the big warehouse data centers. And that's where the growth has occurred so far. And that's where we see the growth occurring going into the future. So let's talk about some of the uncertainties here. So going to the next slide. Where are the data gaps? Like one of the key data gaps is, well, how many chips are going to be actually put into the installed base, into the data center market in the future? And by chips, I mean specifically GPU chips. So they have been growing rapidly, and they're anticipated to grow even more going into the future. We estimate this out to 2028. We don't even try to estimate out beyond that because we can go to 2028 because that's as far as sort of shipment projections can go out. That's in terms of how companies sort of estimate out like what they're planning to purchase. They go out about 5 years. So that's as far as we can go out because that's our model is so sensitive to these results that we have to only go that far. So that's the first part. Next slide. The second is how these chips will be operated in the future makes a big difference in how much electricity use they use, which then drives the overall electricity use of the data center, especially for the large accelerated servers, which are the ones that get the most attention right now. These are the large kind of NVIDIA servers that have multiple GPUs in them. Those can consume lots of electricity. They can draw a lot of power, but it's very dependent on how they're actually used. There's a range. We have an estimate based on talking with industry, talking with researchers, collecting a little bit of empirical data from national labs, but how that evolves in the future is very uncertain without being able to continue that conversation with industry and knowing how things are going to be operated. Next slide. And then another key thing is where will this actually be occurring? Is a bit of a question. So because we estimate this out based on the amount of equipment, we have to do that because data centers don't provide information on how much electricity they use. And so without that information, there's not even really a strong database on where data centers are located. For certain types of data centers, we can know them. There's data centers that rent out their space are pretty publicly available. Very large data centers, you can kind of track down many of them, but a lot of data centers, sort of the medium to fairly large, can be sort of within a building, within a city. It's hard to know where those are often, and without knowing where exactly they are, we don't know which utility is going to need to provide the electricity for those data centers. So we have a database of about 3,500 data centers, but we don't know if that's a complete list. So that's something that we're trying to understand. So better location data is a key area that we're looking at. Next slide. So looking forward, like considering those uncertainties, that's why we can only go out a few years, and there's so much. It's very difficult to know what's beyond that. But thinking about these ideas of right now, there's uncertainty around like how many chips will be out there, how those chips will be operated, where these chips are going to be operated. And that's only going to get more uncertain going into the future as more manufacturers start coming in to make these chips and as more players start operating AI systems. Right now, we can look at like, less than 10 companies that are really operating this equipment and talk to them and get some sense of how equipment's going to be operated in the future. But as it expands and AI is sort of becomes more ubiquitous within all sorts of activities, understanding how this equipment's going to be operated is going to be a key uncertainty going forward. And that makes knowing where these data centers are and getting direct data from these data centers all that much more important. It's important also to highlight when we're thinking about this growth that computational efficiency is not something that really addresses the problem of electricity growth here. There's this idea of with energy efficiency of a rebound effect, like any efficiency kind of goes back into making the service bigger. And with this type of computation around AI, it's almost a perfect rebound effect because there's no limitation identified so far on how much computation is enough. So any efficiency in computations just mean that we're going to have more computations. And then, lastly, it's important to put like this growth that we're seeing on data centers in context to the broader growth of the electricity grid and providing electricity, for society at large. Like there is a goal of electrification with a, as an aim to decarbonization through transportation with electric vehicles, through building electrification, moving to like electric heating in buildings, through electrification in industry. All of this is going to increase the amount of electricity generation that's going to be needed in the US and globally. And really, data centers is kind of the first wave of this increased demand that we're seeing. And so right now it's an opportunity to start developing the foundation for this even greater growth in electricity that we're going to be needing in the near future. So it shouldn't be seen as something that, well, we just need to find a quick solution for this demand right now, but we need to like use this opportunity associated with this demand to be ready for the demand that's coming. And with that, I will sort of end and hand it back to you, Tim.
Great. Thank you so much, Arman. Very concise, but helpful and inclusive of all the key points that I took away from the report. There are some questions being posed in the Q&A, which we'll get to after we go through the other presentations. But if there's any that you think you can respond to directly, please feel free to do so. And yes, we will make these slides available. And I think Alexandria has put a note in the chat about a link to where you can find those in the future. Let me now turn to Vincent from IEA to present the perspective and more of an international perspective and a comparative perspective. So, Vincent, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So, yeah, I will present a few slides on how the IEA trying to assess first this energy demand and also what kind of policy recommendation can be pushed to better first understand this sector, and second facilitate the integration of data center into the grid and limit the impact on local communities of the expansion of this sector. Next slide, please. So the modeling approach. So we are relying on the huge work of LBL and Arman's team. This modeling is also bottom-up modeling, relying a lot of all the hardware equipment shipments. So we are considering the same three kind of IT equipment, but of course the key equipment is the servers, and within the servers there is GPUs and CPUs. We'll talk about this kind of things, but we are considering all these IT equipment shipments as the key driver of our energy demand, and then we are considering operating characteristics, which means basically how much this IT equipment is used and in which infrastructure it is used, how efficient is the infrastructure around this IT equipment. And the key challenge of the IEA is here to provide some international perspective on this topic, because we found very detailed studies in the US, for example, like the report released in December by ABL, but we have also this kind of study in Europe and in China, but global studies on this issue are also necessary to just see how all of this sector is interacting together. And there is a key challenge to see how the global estimates can be reconciled with the regional estimates. So this is also key interaction we have with the stakeholders, regional stakeholders, and the industry, to see how we can reconcile everyone on the projections we are trying to do, even in some regions where there is very little data, for example, Southeast Asia, or this kind of regions where we see strong expansion and development, but there is still little studies which are done specifically on these kind of regions. And the last thing is that just to say that the IEA is not specialized in this assessment of IT equipment and all the dynamics of this sector. So we are relying on IDC input data to help us to inform this modeling. So this is a key input in our model, and it's providing us with the key drivers of this demand. Next slide, please. So one of the key characteristics of this sector, even if the overall demand has been historically still not the lion's share of the electricity demand growth, it has a very strong tendency to cluster, and so this makes it challenging for the integration to the grid, and makes the impact on the local community even bigger. So there is a key challenge. This is a bit explaining the why we are studying this issue, even if it's it accounts just for a small share of the electricity demand so far. So globally, it accounts from 1 to 2% of the electricity demand. In the end, since this electricity demand is very concentrated in a few areas, the local impact on the energy system is still there, and there is still a need to better understand the dynamic. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows some concentration in some areas. So we see that in a few regions. So the estimates for the US was before the release of the latest reports from LBL, but it just shows the range which was estimated before. And you can see that, for example, in Ireland and Virginia, we have some concentration. So this is the share of the electricity demand, and we have some concentration which are already very, very high. And this is even like it's already a geographical average. Like in Ireland, most of the data centers are around Dublin. So the local average is already like decreasing the actual local impact of this industry. So there is really this is really a driver of better understanding this issue because of this density cluster, but there is also a huge uncertainty, and this is what we see on these different ranges, and we will see this on next slide. If we can go to next slide. There is a huge uncertainty on, even for historical data, on how big this issue could be at local scale, but also at the global scale. But even for very well documented country like the US. So this graph shows different estimates from the US for the US, sorry, and we can see that there is a variety of different estimates. So the challenge here is to manage to navigate this, because there is a key issue regarding data centers, that the construction time of data centers is very shorter than the construction time of power generation facilities or transmission line. So there is a bit of a mismatch between these two things, and the energy system has somehow a bit more inertia than the data center industry sector. So there is a need to push for better transparency, a better understanding, to help the anticipation from the energy system, better integrate this industry. And there is another challenge, which is regarding what we call, what is the definition of the different things. For example, here we have the data center capacity, but the range is actually not that big in terms of what people are referring to. It's just like people are calling data center capacity different things. Sometimes people are calling the data center capacity the maximum rated power of all racks which are installed in a data center. Sometimes they are just calling the capacity what is actually the installed servers within a data center, and sometimes they are also calling that capacity what is the advertised power capacity of the data center, which accounts also for all the cooling and auxiliary equipment. So there is different definition. There is a need for standardization among these things to better navigate this topic. If we can go to next slide, please. So here is what we can see as how to better deal with this uncertainty. So first, we've identified the data gaps. So the bottom-up modeling that Arman's and LBL team has been working on for now a lot of years has proved to produce very reliable results. But the thing is that for such modeling, you need very consistent data and reliable data, and also a lot of data. And so you need initiatives to provide this data. So there are already some initiative regarding performance standards for servers. We need also better reporting incentives, better reporting requirements. Even in Europe, we have some data center reporting requirements which are entering into force. And there is also better need for better partnership and people to talk together. Like nobody has the whole picture of this sector, and we need the different parts of the ecosystem to talk together to try to understand what is the big picture. So this is what I mean by involvement of stakeholders to support these initiatives. We need the whole ecosystem from the people who are building the IT equipments to the people who are providing the electricity to the data centers, to talk together to better understand with all the perspectives what is actually going on. If you can go to the next slide. And so to conclude this presentation, I'm just here showing a slide on what we call an observatory on energy, AI, and data centers. This will be this is an initiative launched by the International Energy Agency, which will be actually launched in April, so in 1.5 months, and it will be a place where we'll provide insights on first the energy for AI and data centers, and then also how AI can help the energy sector. We are currently working at the IEA on a report on data centers and AI, energy demand, and also application. But there will be a huge focus on the energy demand with a global overview of the sector and what has been the historical drivers and what will be the different pathways we can see in the energy growth, in electricity growth for data centers. And so this report will also be released in April. And alongside this report, we will have this observatory, which will help to better understand also all the applications. So it will be also mentioned in the report, but there will be new use cases which will be more detailed in the observatory, and all the data in the observatory will be publicly available. So yeah, this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent. Great to get an international perspective, and thank you for your contribution. We're now going to kind of go back to a U.S. focus and kind of shift a little bit to more of policy implications, policy efforts. And let me turn to Tanya Das from the Bipartisan Policy Center to give her perspective. And she has no slides, so you can I don't know what, turn the slides off or what. But Tanya, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's been too long since I left academia, so I've stopped using PowerPoint slides for my presentations. But I was asked to comment on a few policy implications and basically status of the latest policy on the issues that we're talking about today. So first, I'm going to just make a few reflections about the federal policy issues and implications of these numbers that we're seeing in these reports, that the work that Arman and Vincent are doing on projections of data center load growth. And I will just point out for folks, in Arman's report, there was a really great section at the very end that summarized some of the policy implications. So if you want a very detailed breakdown, you all should go read that. But at a high level, a couple takeaways. First of all, as you can see, data center load growth is a very regional problem, and that's important to note because that means that federal policy is going to play a role, an important role, but also state and local policy are extremely important on this issue. We're also seeing a great need for better measurements of data center efficiency. Arman mentioned PUE, power usage efficiency, but there's, I think, vast agreement across the board that that is not the best measurement of data center efficiency. It doesn't account for, amount of compute per unit of energy used. And so there need to be better efforts to actually characterize the efficiency of data centers in a more accurate way. I think there's agreement across the board that there's a need for more frequent reporting on data center energy usage, as well as understanding around the ability for data centers to serve as flexible loads to enable grid reliability. And lastly, more R&D on efficient software and algorithms. So moving beyond just the hardware piece, the chip piece, and kind of looking at the software that sits on top of that and how that can help enable energy improvements. Zooming out a little, looking at the conversations that are happening amongst DC policymakers right now to address these issues. So first, focusing on Congress. So right now, the US Congress is thinking very specifically about tax reform under a broader conversation around reconciliation. Reconciliation is a measure by which, when there's universal control of government, which right now we have Republicans in charge of our House, Senate, and the presidential administration, they can use this this particular budget maneuver to pass legislation that kind of has priorities of that one party at the forefront. This is the measure that was used to pass the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration when Democrats had control, unified control of our government. And so now Republicans are similarly looking at using this measure to pass several reforms to our government, but in particular reforms to taxes. As I mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a package of legislation passed under the Biden administration that made a bunch of investments and changes to energy taxes, is very much a topic of conversation right now for Congress. And that's very important for this conversation about data centers, because changes to energy tax credits may impact our ability to build new generation in the US and may also have impacts on electricity prices, which may impact the attractiveness of to companies for wanting to build more data centers in the US. So that's the piece that Congress is laser focused on right now, and I imagine is going to take up a lot of the oxygen in the room for them until that bill passes, which timing on that is uncertain, could be a few months, could be longer. But once that has been completed, I believe Congress is going to shift its attention to more specific types of policies. One, policies that are focused on addressing the load growth issue overall. So as was mentioned before, data centers are one element that are contributing to load growth in the US right now, but onshoring of manufacturing, increasing electrification of transportation and buildings are also adding to load growth. And from our studies at Bipartisan Policy Center, we're seeing that data centers are perhaps at most 25% of that new load growth, and 75% of new load growth is coming from those other sources. So dealing with all of this increasing load in the US is a problem overall. And so Congress, I think, is very interested in addressing that issue through tools such as permitting reforms, so reforms to our regulatory structure, improvements to our grid modernization, improvements to our transmission system. So there's a whole suite of packages related to electricity load growth that Congress is going to be considering. And I'll also put in a plug for a bill called the Department of Energy Artificial Intelligence Act, which is really focused on the DOE's role in addressing this set of issues. That was a bill that was introduced last year, bipartisan, by Senators Manchin and Murkowski, with a bipartisan companion on the House side as well, with Representatives Williams and Bonamici. And that addressed various pieces of what we're talking about today as well, which includes efficiency improvements for data centers and chips, AI-enabled permitting reform, AI-enabled management of interconnection queues, as well as a research agenda for AI applications under DOE's mission space. So shifting now to the last piece of this, which is the Trump administration and what actions they have taken or are likely to take that will impact these conversations about data center load growth. So to put this in a little bit of context, under the first Trump administration, the administration really focused on trying to put artificial intelligence on the map. At the time, the Department of Energy created an AI coordinating office that was rebranded under the Biden administration, and I'm hopeful perhaps will be rebranded again, but I'm hopeful will remain because that effort has done a lot to make sure that Department of Energy is coordinating across their vast mission space to work on the set of issues. And additionally, under the first Trump administration, there was a supercomputer that debuted called Titan in 2017. That was the first supercomputer in the US to have AI-enabled GPUs. So we saw a lot of movement on this issue under the first Trump administration, and early indications from Trump administration based on statements that they're making in hearings where the nominees for certain positions like the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Interior, are all indicating that AI is front and center for them, and addressing the load growth issues are front and center for them. So one big piece of this is, again, meeting that load growth. And the Trump administration on January 20th released an executive order declaring a national energy emergency and named a few specific federal policy tools that they want to use to address what they're calling a national energy emergency, which includes things like the use of Defense Production Act, expediting completion of energy infrastructure projects, perhaps use of federal eminent domain authorities. It remains to be seen, what specific actions will be taken as a result of this declaration. But this load growth issue is kind of front and center for the Trump administration. So to wrap up, I just want to highlight a few open questions that we're thinking about as we move forward. In a period of load growth, there is definitely an open question around how much of this load growth is going to be served by clean energy versus other forms of energy. There is great interest in a lot of the hyperscalers in using clean energy because they, as private sector companies, have made climate commitments and net zero emissions by 2050 or 100% renewable by 2030 commitments. And so I think that there's going to be an interesting interplay between those commitments and meeting the broader energy needs that our nation is facing. There's also open questions around, how much local interest there's going to be in hosting data centers. So as we saw, that this is a very, very local issue, and there have been more areas of the US who, are kind of raising their hands and saying, what, we don't want this here. But there are some communities in the US who are also saying, like, hey, we really want to be the host of these kinds of new infrastructure projects. And so that's, I think, another open question is, where is it favorable to build in the US, and does that align with communities who want to host these types of infrastructure? And the last question is really for the US, how much of this new data center infrastructure will be built in the US versus abroad? Facing a period of load growth overall, I'm optimistic that our nation can do it, but if there are delays in, the regulatory systems, if there are other features of the environment that make it unfavorable to build, companies may want to go abroad. And so I think members of Congress and the Trump administration are going to be laser focused on trying to make sure that companies want to build here and building a favorable policy environment to enable that. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. Excellent grounding in the policy arena and greatly appreciated. Let's turn to our last speaker, Kelly Saunders, to kind of give her perspective on the broader societal issues and probably building on some of what we heard from Tanya. So if you could put that into presentation mode there. Thank you. There we go. Oh.
Great, thank you. And I think I'm going to, kind of build on a lot of the themes that have already been talked about. That's the tricky thing about going last. But just to give everybody a little bit of a sense of the foundation that I'm coming at this issue from, I'm an energy system analyst. And so I really look at grid issues. So I'm going to be speaking about the grid at large and thinking about how the grid can respond to these new emerging data center loads. So if you go to the next slide. All of the speakers have commented in some way on this issue of load growth more broadly. And so I just want to give a little bit of numeric insight, if I can, about what we're thinking about as we start to anticipate some of the ongoing load growth. So over the last 2 decades, US electricity demand has been largely flat. And all of a sudden, we're at this inflection point where we know that load growth is going up, and we've known that load growth is going up. So to be clear, this data center issue that's really, come to a head in the last couple of years because of the proliferation of AI is putting more pressure on the short-term needs of the grid to respond to this load growth. But as we've been projecting through, let's say, 2035, which is what you see in this chart here from the repeat project. This is a project that comes out of Jesse Jenkins' group at Princeton University. We've been anticipating that load growth is going to grow quite dramatically over the next 10 years or so. And those loads are really being driven by electrified transport, electrified buildings, electrified industries, potentially hydrogen production, potentially cryptocurrency. And as you can see in this chart, in a very, very small writing, these projections don't even include data centers. So as Arman alluded to, we're expecting data center load growth to be on the order of hundreds of terawatt hours over the next few years, just to give you some sense. And projecting out any more into the future is kind of a fool's game. So that's why I just want to give you some insight into the order of magnitude. As we think about load growth more broadly up until the 2035, we're thinking about load growth on the order of thousands of terawatt hours. So the theme that I really want to underpin here is, with or without these data center loads, the United States grid has a challenge. And obviously, we're also at the point where we're seeing all of these climate change impacts. We want to think about how we can address this load growth with clean, reliable energy. And so that's kind of the standpoint that I want to come at this issue with through this talk today. So if we go to the next slide. So even though I just told you that data centers are going to be a fraction, maybe a significant fraction, like Tanya alluded to, maybe as much as 25%, but a smaller fraction of this anticipated load growth, I want to underscore the point that these data center loads are unique. And so they're going to pose unique challenges for regional power grids. The grid really wasn't designed to accommodate new gigawatt scale loads, which is the projection for some of these oncoming loads from these very, very large data center projects. One of the opportunities here is some of these loads might be a little bit flexible. So they might be flexible in where we site the data center loads. So some of these facilities are very latency sensitive, meaning that they have to be sited next to big demand centers. That's why you see a lot going up in Northern Virginia, for example. But some of these facilities, particularly those that are dedicated to the training of artificial intelligence models, for example, have a little bit more flexibility in terms of where they might be sited. And so that might be an opportunity to site the data centers where we have excess capacity. Some of these loads might also be able to be run flexibly. So maybe we can ramp down certain workloads when the grid is under stress. But I think that we should assume that for a lot of this industry, they are adding to what we call peak capacity. And that's what's really tricky about these particular loads. We actually have plenty of energy across the US energy grid, or the US power grid. The problem is we have to plan for that day in August where it's really hot and everyone's running its air conditioning. If you put a load on top of that pre-existing, that's where we really start to break down in terms of reliability. So meeting these large around-the-clock demand will be difficult. And you can see on this map, this is projected reserve margin shortfalls across the United States over the next few years. And what this basically means is this is the margin between projected resources and peak net demand. And so you can see across a lot of the country, we're already starting to butt up against our available capacity during those peak periods. So if we go to the next slide. I think one of the things that I don't know is being reflected in the conversation at large in this issue is powering these large data center loads. It's going to be expensive no matter what resource you pick to meet them. And some of that is because adding capacity to the grid is an expensive proposition, whether you do it with natural gas or whether you do it by renewables. Renewables themselves are very, very cheap generally, but you're probably going to have to couple them with battery storage, which raises the cost of those those projects. But some of the benefit of those solar plus batteries is these projects are up and ready to go. Unlike natural gas, which is also going to be a lot more expensive than people realize, building a new natural gas facility in 2025 is much more expensive than building just a few years ago. There's shortages of turbines, and so it's going to be hard to get these projects online fast. In a lot of regions, there's actually constraints in the natural gas grid. So I think there's this assumption that we can just lean on natural gas in the worst case scenario. And I would say that in a lot of regions, we have to challenge that assumption because it's going to be inexpensive and it's going to require other infrastructure modifications. And you might not be able to get these facilities online at the speed in which you want to. And so I would say a lot of analyses are underestimating the true cost of bringing this new capacity online. So economic analyses really have to be honest about how much powering these facilities or adding this capacity to the grid are going to be. The next slide. I would propose, as we look at this issue, we really need to have an all of the above clean load growth strategy. And this strategy can include squeezing more power out of the grid that we already have. So this can be through grid enhancing technologies, advanced reconductoring, adding storage to certain parts of the transmission system to relieve congestion, identifying underused interconnections. So for example, there's a lot of coal-fired power facilities that don't use the full capacity that they've been allotted in the interconnection system. So we could add capacity at those modes. These are all fast, ready to go solutions to try to increase the capacity of the existing grid. Second, accelerating emerging clean firm energy deployment. So we have small modular reactors, we have enhanced geothermal systems, long duration energy storage. These opportunities are still quite expensive, but the tech industry is really, really aggressively evaluating some of these options, and they have some of the financing mechanisms to bring these through. So I think that's a potential opportunity. But again, we have to be clear and we have to be honest about the cost of some of the incumbent technologies to make sure that we're really taking a realistic approach to how much these are going to cost. Third point, we should leverage flexibility when possible. I talked about this somewhat before, but can we shift these loads operationally? Can we be flexible in terms of where we site these facilities? Can we site them where we have excess or curtailed renewables, for example? Can we put storage, clean storage on site at these facilities so that they can actually be a resource to the grid during peak demand? And then the last, we really have to maximize on-site energy efficiency opportunities. Sometimes adding the latest and the greatest energy efficiency strategies add to the cost of the data center. But if you're honest about the cost of powering those facilities, some of these energy efficiency strategies actually become a lot more cost effective as opposed to if you assume that you're getting cheap electricity from the grid. And so for my last slide, I know that I'm running out of time, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here. Maybe it'll come up during Q&A, but I just want to make the point that, you know, from a federal landscape perspective, the conversation has shifted from the last administration on energy at large, but state and local governments have a big role to play here, regulators have a big role to play here, and utilities and even the large energy consumers themselves can do a lot to push these clean energy priorities, develop innovative rate structures that influence the behavior of these data center facilities to be beneficial to the grid, incentivizing these low-hanging fruit investments, accelerating the deployment of clean firm resources, perhaps adding to the transparency of reporting these loads so that we can plan a little bit more farther into the future. So I would say, you know, there's a lot of potential opportunity here through addressing load growth through the sector specifically. But there's also this potential challenge that we could kind of boomerang back into fossil fuel consumption. So I think we really need to be creative about the way that we address this from the grid perspective. And I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Very, very helpful. If we could bring up the panelists in the video part of this, that'd be helpful. Fantastic. So this is an opportunity for you as panelists to pose questions to other panelists. Anything that occurred to you, if you wanted to learn a little bit more about that perspective or not. We have some 15 questions I want to try to get to. There's some that are overlapping, but I want to make sure we get through as many of those as we can. But anything that any of you want to say to each other in response to what you heard, or a question that you have for each other?
Yeah, I'll ask you a question if you don't mind. But I'm just curious, as you've transitioned from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, how do you've talked about some of the shifting winds, but I'm just curious about your level of optimism or pessimism in terms of addressing load growth, because I hear that Congress has this on their mind, but some of the executive orders seem to conflict with what we might need to do from the electricity side, at least. So I'm just curious what your finger in the air read of this is from an optimism standpoint.
Who was that directed to?
Tanya.
Tanya, okay. Tanya, any thoughts?
Got it. Sorry, I thought you were directing that to Tim. I think this administration wants to address the load growth issue. There is huge disagreement between the former administration and this administration on what technologies should be used to address that load growth. So I'm optimistic on the first part. I'm uncertain about the amount of clean, firm energy that'll be used to address the load growth. Since I have the floor, I'd love to pose a question to Arman and Vincent quickly. In my work on innovation, we focus a lot on the improvements of cost and energy in each new iteration of a technology. And obviously the DeepSeek announcement was a big one for the US. I think folks seemed really surprised that, China was able to create an AI model that ran so much more energy efficiently and so much more cost effectively than ChatGPT, but it kind of made a lot of sense to me because that's how innovation works. I am curious in your modeling if you were able to account for potential efficiency improvements in your models, or if that's something you're hoping to incorporate in the future.
And I think there's been some controversy over how much efficiency improvements there are with the DeepSeek approach, if not DeepSeek itself. So maybe if you can comment on that as well.
Sure, I'll take this first. Well, first on to answer that last part. Yeah, there is a little uncertainty. I mean, the information that came out on DeepSeek shows that the model performs very well. Is what we've been told. What my understanding is. It's not clear exactly how energy efficient it is, because I think they're coming up with that estimate based on the cost, and so there's a question about how much it's being subsidized. Also, the energy efficiency part was really focused on the training side of AI and not the inference side, which is something that's going to be growing in the future. Inference is going to be a bigger part, and DeepSeek didn't really address that. My understanding is that it's actually less efficient on the inference side than what's being used now, sort of in the US. That said, the general idea of this is where I would say the evolution of the technology is going to go. It's going to become more efficient. There's going to be a better use of the hardware to get more out of it. That's what has happened in the past. This came out of China because they they had a limited amount of chips to work with, so they did what they could with a limited amount of chips. What I don't think that won't affect our model, and it's one of the reasons why we only went out to 2028, because we know that this is going to happen. These kind of efficiencies are going to happen in the future. We don't expect, like, when DeepSeek first came out, there was a big thought of like, okay, is our model completely like incorrect? There was the question we were being asked, and no, like going out to 2028, the type of purchases for chips, I expect that to happen, even if the computations became that much more efficient here in the US. The chips that are already sort of in the pipeline would be getting implemented into the data centers, and they would be used. It just means that AI would grow faster, essentially. I think that kind of efficiency of the chips can affect the demand for chips in the future, beyond 2028. But of course, that's a balance between the growth of the service, and so there's a balance there of uncertainty, and that's kind of how it's played out in the 2010s, that there was this efficiency of the equipment, and that was balanced with the growth of the industry.
Great. Anything you want to add, Vincent?
Just a few things also regarding how we are dealing with this issue at the IEA and in the modeling we're doing. So basically, considering this big uncertainty range, what the approach we choose is a scenario-based approach with a set of different assumptions regarding efficiency of the software, efficiency of the hardware, local constraints, and this kind of thing, which are we choose different assumptions, and we see in which direction we are going. So what we want to avoid is to show these things as forecasts, because it's more like trajectories where we can go with these assumptions and these situations. But of course, if there is like these game-changing events which are occurring, we cannot predict this. We don't have kind of a crystal ball which can explain what will be for sure the energy consumption from data centers in 2028 or even in 2025, when we see the uncertainty range, even for recent historical data, it's already something. It's not negligible. So there is really this question. And to come back to the DeepSeek thing in itself, there is a huge incentives to maximize the utilization of all this high performance hardware, accelerators and accelerated servers, because it's very expensive to have. So once you have one, you want to utilize it as much as you can. So it's typically the kind of thing where the efficiency would just create more demand to still have a high utilization of these servers. But I don't see this kind of servers to see a very decrease in the utilization. What we can see is a decrease in the growth of the stock. So the fact that we will need less servers to do the same things, but the servers themselves, there is a incentive to use them as much as we can, because they are very expensive. And the last thing for DeepSeek, regarding this inference thing, that's first thing is that regarding the inference, we don't really know how more efficient they are, the model is regarding the benchmark we have currently. And secondly, when we look at some features of the inference from DeepSeek, when we look at a normalized metric, which is usually a token, like energy consumption per token, which is so basically a token like two token our word, let's say. So when you look at the length of the output, is much longer than the one of conventional large language models. So the thing is that when you normalize the efficiency, you can have something bigger. But again, it's a bit like this rebound effect. You have just much longer output. And for DeepSeek, Sasha Lucioni, I saw this her name on the chat. Sasha Lucioni did some experiments regarding DeepSeek and saw some output with 20,000 tokens, which means 10 pages of length for a query, which is of course impacting the energy consumption of this thing. So there is to sum up, there is two things. high incentive to use this hardware as much as we can. And the second one is regarding the inference side, DeepSeek, there is an uncertainty of how much efficiency it provides.
Okay, great. Let me suggest we shift a little bit, and I'm going to try to summarize some of the 19 questions that have been posed in the Q&A. And one of them was about DeepSeek, and I think we've addressed that question. But there's a fair amount of questions that have to do with sort of the local dimension to this challenge. We had a webinar in December that focused on kind of the local orientation towards data center proliferations. In the data transparency issues and a number of requests for the lists that underlie the work that you and your colleagues have done, Arman. My understanding is that there's some limitations on your ability to share that list, but there clearly is a desire to understand more about the load growth that's happening, the proliferation of these data centers in a locality specific or regional specific. Anything that Arman that you want to say about that, or other panelists about kind of the geographic dimension and how to get a handle on that? I'm going to turn to some other related topics about data transparency after that. But anything about the geographic dimension and how stakeholders, whether they're state level, local level, governmental policy, or citizens who are concerned. There was someone from the Tonawanda Seneca Nation raising questions about a specific proposal in that area. How can people get information to address their desires to learn more about what's happening in the localities and places in which they reside and work in terms of any policy making? Anybody want to take that on? Or let me see if there's anything you want to say, and then we'll see if others want to contribute.
Yeah, just on a quick sort of overview. I mean, to understand where data centers are located, there are data sets out there. They're typically, like, if you kind of just Google and kind of look around for them, you'll see that there's usually by real estate firms like have data center locations, mainly for co-location data centers, because they're providing a service for rental space. Unfortunately, that's only a subset of the data center market overall, and each location doesn't really tell you much about like how much power it might draw. Some of the locations will kind of give a sense of like what the size is or what the capacity is, but they use different units in terms of size, so it's hard to translate that onto, to compare from one location to the other. That said, there is a lot of interest in knowing sort of where this power is. So like consulting firms like McKinsey and S&P Global are, they're able to get like analysts to work around the clock to like slowly and meticulously come up with data sets. So they do have data sets out there, but they're they're behind a paywall. They're usually being sold to investors. But those are what are out there, and we're trying to create a public one now, but it's difficult to do so.
Kelly, anything that you want to say about that?
No, I think it's covered. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let me actually more than one of the questions. Most of the discussion so far in this webinar has been about power usage, load growth, and not so much on water impacts, water consumption, and there's other social impacts, environmental justice impacts. We're hoping to spend more time in the NDEE focusing on those topics as well. But I'm just wondering whether any of the panelists want to make any comments about some other kinds of impact other than the energy consumption, load growth kinds of impact that have been the primary focus of the contributions that you all have made.
I can start on the water side. So I've looked a lot at the water impacts of various cooling systems. And one of the challenges here is that, there's various ways that you can cool a facility. Some of that is by air, just putting air across the data infrastructure. Some of it is water cooled. And there's a trade-off between these two technical option, sorry, for lack of better words. You know, like if you're really hot on a hot day, you would rather jump into the Pacific Ocean or rather than use a fan to cool yourself. Water just has a higher heat capacity than air does for removing heat. And so there's this trade-off that a lot of our air-cooled systems aren't as efficient than our water-cooled systems because you can't remove the heat as fast. So there's this inherent tension between water efficiency and energy efficiency. Sometimes there's a trade-off there. Water is generally much more efficient at removing that heat. Now, there's been a lot of innovation in cooling systems. So there's immersive cooling systems that don't use a lot of water and they can use other mediums. But as some of the comments in the chat have alluded to, you have to say, okay, well, if water isn't being used for these cooling mediums, what is? And sometimes you introduce new chemicals and new environmental impacts. Those immersive cooling systems also tend to be more expensive. There is innovation on this issue because of the water impacts of a lot of these data centers, which are concerning in a lot of regions, especially regions like Phoenix, which has seen a lot of data center growth, but also has water challenges. So some data centers are looking at the opportunity to use gray water, so to use non-potable water for cooling. This introduces some operational challenges. There's also going to be in the future, and already is, competition for those non-traditional water uses. So a lot of cities are already using those for power plant cooling or golf courses. There's also a lot of innovation on heat recovery technologies. So taking the heat from data centers and using them for another beneficial purpose, which reduces the heat load that you need to cool with some sort of outside fluid. So I would say that this is really a big area for R&D and research and innovation. But the challenge is water is just a really efficient medium. So the water usage and the local impacts, particularly in water-stressed regions, is something that we really have to look at closely.
Great. Any other comments from the panel on the water usage element?
Which is more on the last part of the Kelly's contribution on the heat recovery and this aspect, because the water aspect at the IEA is at the limit of the scope. So we try to address it as well, but it's at the limit of our expertise. So we are less contributing to this aspect, but for the heat recovery, we're trying to understand, especially in some areas which are very dense, like Europe, for example, where there is a huge potential for recovery of this heat. There is already the infrastructure and these things, the district heating networks which are already there, and the data center hubs which are not that far from this network. So there is a something to study here for the potential, and so this will also be explored in the report we are releasing in a few weeks. Great.
I'm not seeing Arman or Tanya want to step up. I'm going to read a question from the Q&A, and then I'm going to build on it. It says, given the data gaps, how might we create a generalizable formula for water and power consumption that data scientists could apply to their particular use cases to better understand the environmental impacts of what they are building? Is this possible without cooperation from data center owners? I want to see if you can respond to that question, but also, Tanya, you alluded to the climate commitments that many of these data centers, the companies that own these data centers, the big tech companies have made. I'm just wondering, in addition to the possibility of a sort of generalizable formula and whether that can be developed. So I think maybe Arman and Vincent on the modeling side could talk about whether that makes sense as a path to getting to a better understanding of these impacts. But also, Tanya, maybe you can comment on whether you think there's some possibility, and maybe Kelly as well, as the forcing mechanism, Kelly, that you referred to, that data centers are providing. Can it lead towards voluntary efforts that can help deal with some of these data transparency issues? What's the likelihood of that happening? How can pressure be brought to bear to try to get these companies to build on their existing voluntary commitments to try to close the gap in terms of transparency. So Arman, I'll hold on the last question, but to you, but what about this generalizable kind of formula approach and whether that can be developed without cooperation from data center owners?
I would say it's challenging because we really need to be able to have raw data. I mean, otherwise it's hard to compare against, from one data center to the next. It's the data center industry, typically they don't really want to provide that kind of raw data. Like they're very good at providing as like numbers about how much like renewable electricity they use, but they don't provide the denominator. So you never know out of how much total it actually represents. So I think it's a good idea, and I think that like the publications that are coming out, we're trying to kind of through GitHub like put out sort of data sets on locations, but it's really challenging without there being sort of a systematic kind of data collection that can be really raw data that can be like compared, something similar to like what the Department of Energy does for commercial buildings and residential buildings. It needs that kind of data collection process.
Yeah. Tanya, anything on the voluntary kind of dimension and whether there's some prospects for that picking up some momentum? And Kelly, if you want to comment on that as well, but Tanya, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think there absolutely is. I think there's a lot that can be done on a voluntary basis. For a little bit of context here, when it comes to chip efficiency, the Department of Energy played a major role in helping improve the energy efficiency of AI chips based on its involvement in its supercomputing program. So between 2012 and 2021, DOE helped drive a 200 times energy efficiency improvement in these chips. And that was more focused on the hardware piece. But there's been recent conversations about Department of Energy, focusing more on the algorithms and the software that lives on top of the hardware. And, those efficiency gains that DOE helped drive were absolutely hand in hand with the private sector. DOE kind of set forward some ambitious goals and then worked with the private sector, worked with NVIDIA, AMD, to help build those, to help achieve those goals. And I could see a very similar confluence happening when we're talking about the hardware, when we're talking about the software and algorithms piece, where DOE can maybe set forth some very ambitious goals and work with the private sector to help realize those without the need for requirements or a regulation on a voluntary basis.
Great, thank you for that. Kelly, any thoughts you have about this?
Yeah, in your question, you asked kind of like what are the broader societal kind of forcing mechanisms here. And I think that one thing that we're going to see, and we're already seeing as a result of this load growth that's coming online a lot faster than the utilities were anticipating, is I think you're going to see a lot of innovation. I've been in the energy space for a long time now, and it's pretty exciting, the plethora of tools, the suite of tools that we have to address this load growth. And I think you're going to start to see a lot of demand side innovation, the collaboration between the demand side of the power system and the supply side of the power system. There's a lot of innovation happening in the transmission system with grid enhancing technologies and advanced reconductoring, et cetera. And I think you're seeing, as Tanya alluded to, a lot of interest in the efficiency gains that can be had in cooling systems, the chips, the hardware, the software, et cetera. And I think it helps that, at least traditionally, historically, the tech industry has been very concerned about its sustainability commitment. So, and I think that a lot of the large energy purchasers themselves have very aggressive sustainability commitments. So I'm seeing a lot of action for these big energy consumers to come together and to put pressure on the utilities to find clean solutions so that they can actually purchase the electricity. So that's coming from, new clean tariff pricing mechanisms that are coming to bear so that these large energy buyers can actually pay a bit of a premium in terms of the electricity that they are buying in order to pay for some of these, quote unquote, greener technologies and solutions to come online. So I think you are seeing a lot of innovation. I think people right now are rightly very worried about the risk of boomeranging back into natural gas and potentially letting coal-fired power plants operate longer than they otherwise would. But I think people are going to quickly realize building natural gas in this country right now is very difficult with some of the disruptions in the supply chain, et cetera. So I'll leave it there.
Great. I think you addressed one of the questions posed in the chat and in the Q&A about how might improvements or lack of improvements to transmission and power grid impact demand and efficiency of data centers. Anything else you want to say about that question? But I think you might have addressed most of that. Kelly?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is a great question. And I think the utilities are looking at this from an all of the above strategy. I think some of the challenge, especially on the transmission side, is what's been alluded to, is building new transmission is really hard. We need permitting reform. And we also need a little bit of innovation on the regulatory side. So a lot of times these utilities are incentivized to do big capital intensive infrastructure projects like building new transmission lines, building new power plants. That's not only expensive, they take a long time. We need like quick solutions now. And some of those solutions are not capital intensive. And so I think the regulators need to be a little bit more progressive in terms of thinking about how to incentivize utilities to do efficiency projects, to do more with the grid that we have now. And that's something that can really happen at the state level. We don't need the federal government to make some of those interventions. So we need a lot of innovation on the regulatory side and the pricing side to make some of these solutions go forward.
Great. Okay, I'm scrolling through the Q&A here. I don't know if other panelists are doing the same, but if there's a question that you feel like you're particularly well positioned to respond to, please step up. We're going to run out of time here in a few minutes, but anything that you see that's coming through on the Q&A or the chat that you want to make sure you respond to before we have to wrap up? Okay, one of the things I want to raise is the increase in energy consumption and load growth and transmission, the connection to the grid, and a lot of what we talked about is not really directly addressing the environmental and the human health impacts of those sources of electricity and even the data centers themselves with diesel power backup. We're hoping to spend more time on those kinds of topics through the work of the Environmental Law Institute's network and digital economy and the environment in the future. But I just want to note that the kinds of issues about the grid and electricity consumption, energy consumption, do have environmental and human health consequences, and we're only sort of scratching the surface when we talk about it at the level that we're talking about it right now. So my hope is, as these voluntary efforts, if they do begin to increase, can also be addressing those kinds of impacts. And I'm going to close maybe with Tanya, maybe for you and for other panelists. I mean, it occurs to me, I remember years ago with hazardous waste facility siting, it became a national issue. The siting of these facilities became a national issue decades ago. And I'm just wondering whether there are siting issues here for sure, and the water issues in the West that have been raised. But is there any chance that we could, as a nation, begin to look at this in a holistic way and try to rationally address these kinds of impacts that, I mean, everyone is looking forward to the positive impacts that AI will have on our lives, but this is certainly one of the potential areas of negative impacts, and they're going to be localized in terms of how they manifest themselves. Anybody want to respond to that possibility of a facility siting process for data centers, or whether that's just pie in the sky thinking. Anybody? Oh, go ahead,
I'll
Tony.
just jump in and say, that's why I think it's extremely important that communities have a say in what is cited where they live, and it's important that that be a bottom-up process, right? There are some communities who are very excited to have data centers where they live, and are seeing certain benefits, tax benefits, employment benefits, and there are other communities that are deeply opposed. So I think it's important to start from there.
Great. We do need to wrap up. Alexandra, if you can come back on, and any closing remarks from your perspective.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Tim. And just thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for this discussion today. As Tim mentioned, this is just one webinar in a series that we're conducting about data centers. We're hoping to continue to dive into these topics. So if you want, you can just leave it a thank you and appreciation for our panelists today in the chat. We'll be following up with a survey for you to fill out, very brief, just a couple of minutes, so that you can give us your thoughts about this webinar and any future events that you would be interested in attending. So we'll follow up with a link to that in the chat here, as well as sending around a survey email. So yeah, if you want to stay updated on anything with NDE, you can go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. We'll be sending that out bi-monthly. Thank you all again so much for being part of this conversation. We look forward to staying connected. And just once again, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists and to Tim, our amazing moderator.
Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are.